My dad was a striver. A striver. He had a work ethic that worked him hard. As a medical director, as a missionary, as a therapist, in every iteration of his service to God and humans, he worked hard. And when he wasn't working, he was working. He played the piano, but not for fun, for perfection. He cut wood, he rode a bike, he even cut grass as if his life depended on it. I remember being a little kid sitting next to him while he practiced scales on the piano. Up and down the keyboard, his fingers just flew. It was so boring to sit by him while But when he went on to play Beethoven or Schubert or Debussy, it was glorious. As an adult, I look back on my dad's relentless work ethic and see it much like I see the story of Exodus. In fact, for many of us, the story of Exodus speaks into our life about histories of bondage. For many years as a child, my dad lived in an abusive, chaotic home, and he found solace and calm in all kinds of work. And he clung to that. He ordered his life and every day around work. I bet you know people like that too, and perhaps you are that person. Striving, working, surviving, these things occupy most of our time. But what if there is a better way? What if there was a promised land that we could access right now and find wholeness in our own perspectives and behaviors, find balance, find peace? In the first reading we heard, the one from the book of Exodus in the Hebrew scriptures, Moses was leading his tribe, the descendants of a man named Israel, leading them out of their enslavement in Egypt. And they had entered a wilderness. They were not happy. Yes, there was evidence of God's divine activity, and yes, they were glad of that, but they were in a new reality, a wilderness, a place devoid of all that was familiar, especially the sunrise to sunset structure of work. This place had very little structure besides getting everybody fed, livestock and people, the day-to-day task of keeping alive. There was no structure. It was a place without culture or entertainment, no movie theater, no steakhouse or pub. There were rocks, but no rock band. There were plants, but no plantation. It was dismal, and there they were. They didn't know how to do wilderness. They only knew the life of enslavement. The stories they told were about outsmarting the taskmaster, and all their jokes were about dumb Egyptians. And now, here they were in the wilderness. Ever hear a cactus joke? Yeah, me either. They hadn't either. This place was a kind of death by subtraction. But the wilderness was an opportunity to learn how to leave a culture and system of bondage, how to open themselves to a different kind of life. And for all of us, these moments of wilderness come. It may be after a graduation or a decision to drop out of school. It may be after a death or a move to a new city or a job loss or retirement. But suddenly, the things that had filled us and given us identity are gone. Time shifts, relationships morph, and we grieve for where we have arrived. This is part of our journey to the Promised Land. It has the potential to take us toward a life of milk and honey, a land of fruitful labor and flourishing. Yeah, maybe. But how do we live in a wilderness, and how do we get to that land from here? That's the question we must answer. Where we go is up to us, and how we cope is our decision. The Israelites complained and murmured, and God provided food and water. God sustained them for 40 years. But the people in this story, they died wandering. They didn't make it to the promised land. Their children did. These folks couldn't let go of their need to strive, to control the narrative, to hold on to the past. But our story can be different. All our moments of transition are opportunities to recognize that God is inviting us out of bondage and into the freedom of abundant life. The God we know in Jesus Christ is showing us a better way. We don't have to live with the constant striving that forms us, or the apathetic inertia that drags us down, or the hunger and longing for what we don't have, or the fear that paralyzes us. There is a better way. Let me give you a phrase to think about on how to move toward the promised land, toward a way of living that is truly life-giving. This isn't the greatest phrase, but work with me here. It is enough to be focused, full, and feeling pain. It is enough to be focused, full, and feeling pain. So let's unpack that. Heading for the promised land is our focus, and the best way to sense it is to rest in it. It is to be focused not on the destination, but on the divine, because God is our promised land. God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter in the stormy blast, and our eternal home. When we center our lives on the eternal, the mystery of the eternal present in this day, in your breath, we become much more aware of the small gifts of manna that come each day from beyond. We stay focused on what is true and real. And when we stop looking around for more, stop working for the sake of work, and start appreciating our situation as enough for now, receiving our daily bread, we will find that what we used to be doesn't have to determine who we are now. We focus on God's gift of now. Are you lonesome? Look around. Are you hungry? Look around. Your divine lover has left for you the traces of that love. Where is it? The needs we have, the basic ones, they must be met. But so often it's our bondage, it's our enslavement that keeps us from being able to even access what we need. This is why the Israelites needed the wilderness, so they could slow down, stop striving, and learn to rethink their freedom, their time, their enoughness, and most importantly, their God. To learn that God is ready and willing, completely able to satisfy. I'm 55, and I have been preaching a long time. And I believe in the Trinitarian God. I have lived in that belief even longer than I've been ordained, which is a good thing. But I have just begun to claim the reality that I am standing before you, that I just said. I will confess that for years now, when my inner world is disturbed, my first reflex is to put something in my mouth. Because I am beginning to embody the truth that if I take a beat and open my spirit to God's enoughness, I can stop feeding with things that will not fulfill and sense the fulfillment of God. I've been teaching that a long time, but I am now here to testify that it actually works. That I actually can sense the mystery of presence when I turn myself toward God instead of the kitchen cabinet where the snacks are. Something shifts in my core, and it is enough. And you have whatever it is that's been filling you, and it might not be what goes in your mouth. I don't know, but we all have that tendency because we've grown up in the bondage of Egypt. How do we learn to eat the manna, the mystery of God's presence? That's our focus. and that enoughness, that fullness of God, is our way to the promised land. When we focus on the eternal gift of every day, when we allow ourselves not to just do, but to be, we are on the edge of that sense of God's fullness for us. So it is enough to be focused. It's enough to be full, but it's also feeling pain. That last thing is the weirdest and perhaps the hardest. We have to be purposeful about pain. The Israelites didn't want to deal with the reality of their pain. They didn't want to remember that the Egyptians had killed their babies, whipped them, abused them, deprived them of so much. They chose a delusional history about flesh pots and bread, and oh, it was so great back there, remember? Doing that hurt them. The idealized past warped their capacity to see the present. The Apostle Paul, in that letter to the Philippians that we read a minute ago, chapter 1, verse 29, God has granted you the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but of suffering for him. Suffering for Christ. Struggling through pain is part of our path toward the promised land. Yes, life brings suffering all by itself, but most of us are doing our very best to avoid as much as possible. More and more of our culture doesn't even grieve our dead. We don't even do funerals as much as we used to, and we're already living in the tragic consequences of prescribing away our pain. What would it look like if instead we faced our pain? If we held God's hand while we dipped our toes in discomfort and dissonance and despair? What if we pushed our bodies more? What if we allowed ourselves to be uncomfortable more? What might we learn? Wilderness places are great locations for all of the above: discomfort, despair, dissonance. If Jesus' death tells us about the nature of God, and of course it does, then it tells us that suffering is where God does some of God's best work. Before most miracles, someone was suffering, and God met them. Learning to engage and struggle with the wisdom that comes from pain is a part of the wilderness. So there they are, the people of Israel, in the incubator of wilderness between their old life of bondage and their new life of promised land, and God gives them what they need: enough. It is enough to be focused, to be full even of little bits of stuff they don't even know what it's called, and to feel their pain. They didn't think it was enough, but it was. We might not think it's enough, but it is. Maybe we're still looking backward or forward instead of looking around. God has given us the bread of heaven, the daily nourishment for our journey. Are we seeing it? Are we eating it? Are we taking it in and letting us give life? God is there in the wilderness, and in the life of Jesus, we see powerful witnesses of love meeting people in their most dire situations. When my dad was dying, I flew out to be with him for one last visit. And at that point, he was on oxygen, and he had an oxygen tube that was so long, he could leave the oxygen tank in the hallway and walk all around his house with it, which his cats thought was perfect. Something to play with. But walking wore my dad out. His lungs were so impaired, so we mostly just sat on the couch and visited. But at one point, I reminisced with him about those old days at the piano with the scales. I told him how much I had loved it when he played Moonlight Sonata and Clair de Lune, and he assured me that he was still playing. He got up and he slowly led me to his keyboard. Down the hall we went into a corner of his bedroom. The little Casio keyboard was covered with sheet music, and there was no chair. He sat on the bed and he played. For a while, he struggled. He was reading the music and getting mad at himself because he wasn't perfect, just like always. Exasperated, he pushed the music aside and he leaned back, catching his breath. I reminded him of a simple tune, a song I had always loved, and I told him, it reminds me of you. He brightened. I hummed it a little bit. He's like, oh yeah, that's from Beethoven's Pathétique, Movement 2. He leaned forward and he began to play from memory. The music was sweet and simple, and he forgave himself that it wasn't perfect. He played out of his soul, out of the place where the music had fed him and carried him, because music is a language God so often uses. Would that my dad had found that freedom years ago, but he found it then, and he has found it now. What about us? In our wilderness, there is a God, a mystery of the universe, a holy one. There is manna and there is hurt. May we follow the breadcrumbs that lead us into the holy, and may we choose to see that they are enough, focusing on the eternal, finding fullness in today's gifts without avoiding the pain. These are the keys to the promised land, to the life of Christ. It is our way, our truth, and our life.